In the winter of 1887, a geologist named Edmund Thorne submitted a paper to the Royal Geographical Society in London. The paper was 47 pages long. It contained detailed field measurements taken over 3 years across formations in Wyoming, Venezuela, and the Ethiopian highlands. It included microscopic analysis of rock samples. It included mathematical calculations comparing the geometry of columnar formations to the cellular geometry of known plant tissue. Its conclusion was stated plainly in the final paragraph. The formations currently classified as volcanic intrusions and sedimentary uplift are, in the assessment of this researcher, the mineralized remains of biological structures of extraordinary scale. The geometry is biological. The mineral composition is consistent with biosilicification. The global distribution is consistent with a prior biological world whose remnants we have misidentified as geology. The paper was rejected, not reviewed, not debated, not published with editorial comment, rejected within 11 days of submission, a timeline that, for an institution that routinely took 6 months to review submissions, was itself extraordinary. Edmund Thorne never published in a major scientific journal again. Within 2 years, he had lost his university position. Within 5 years, his field notes, 3 years of primary research data, had disappeared from the university archive where he had deposited them. Within 10 years, his name had been removed from the acknowledgement sections of papers he had contributed to. By 1900, Edmund Thorne had effectively ceased to exist in the scientific record, and the measurements he took, the cellular geometry comparisons, the biosilicification analysis, the mathematical ratios that placed the columnar formations outside the range of geological processes and inside the range of biological ones, those measurements have never been formally refuted. They were not refuted. They were erased. This is his story. And it is also the story of how a scientific framework decides what is allowed to be true. Edmund Thorne was not a fringe figure. He was not the kind of researcher whose rejection can be explained by prior eccentricity or a history of poor methodology. He was born in Bristol in 1849. He studied geology at University College London under John Wesley Judd, one of the most respected petrologists of the Victorian era. He graduated with distinction in 1871 and spent the following decade building a solid, unremarkable career in field geology. He published 14 papers in the decade before 1887. All of them were accepted. Several were cited by colleagues. His work on sedimentary formations in the Lake District was included in a standard reference volume used in British universities until the 1920s. He was, by every professional measure, exactly the kind of geologist whose submissions the Royal Geographical Society took seriously. Which makes what happened to his 1887 paper more difficult to explain through the usual mechanisms. The paper was the product of 3 years of fieldwork that Thorne had begun in 1884 after an observation that he described, in a letter to a colleague dated March of that year, as something he could not stop thinking about. The letter reads, and this document exists, preserved in a private archive in Bristol, as follows. I have been examining the columnar formations at several sites in the American territories and find myself unable to reconcile their geometry with the columnar jointing explanation we were taught. The diameter consistency is wrong, the wall thickness ratios are wrong. I have compared the cross-sections under magnification with wood cell preparations I obtained from the University Botanical Department, and the similarity is not approximate. It is exact. I do not know what this means, but I intend to find out. He spent the next 3 years finding out. He traveled to Wyoming and spent 6 months measuring and sampling the formations there. He traveled to Venezuela and spent 4 months at the base of the Tepuis. He traveled to the Ethiopian highlands and spent 3 months examining the amber formations. He brought samples back to London and spent a year analyzing them. What he found became the 47-page paper that the Royal Geographical Society rejected in 11 days. The paper has never been published, but portions of it survive, in letters Thorne wrote to colleagues describing his findings, in notes that were not included in the archive materials that disappeared, and in a partial transcript that appears in the private journal of a society member who read it before the rejection. That journal entry reads, "Thorne's paper is extraordinary. Whether it is correct, I cannot say. But it is not the work of a man who has lost his reasoning. The measurements are meticulous. The comparisons are specific. The conclusion follows from the data. I do not know how to evaluate a conclusion that requires us to revise everything we think we know about the age and nature of the formations we have spent 50 years classifying." What did the paper actually argue? Based on the surviving fragments, Thorne made 5 specific claims. The first claim was geometric. The diameter-to-wall thickness ratio of the columns in the formations he examined fell consistently outside the range produced by thermal stress fracture, the physics of columnar jointing, and inside the range produced by vascular plant tissue. He had measured this ratio in dozens of samples from multiple continents, and the results were consistent. The second claim was mineralogical. The silicon dioxide content of the formations was inconsistent with a purely volcanic origin, but consistent with biosilicification, the biological uptake and deposition of silica in plant cell walls. He noted specifically that the distribution of silica within the rock was not uniform, as it would be in solidified lava, but concentrated in the structural elements that would correspond to cell walls if the material had originally been biological. The third claim was distributional. No shared geological process connected the formations he had examined across 3 continents. They had no common volcanic origin, no shared tectonic history, no geological mechanism that would produce identical structures in Wyoming, Venezuela, and Ethiopia. But a shared biological origin, a global forest of the same organism type, would produce identical structures everywhere that organism had grown. The fourth claim was scalar. Using the biological ratio of stump base diameter to total tree height, Thorne calculated the heights of the living organisms that the formations represented. He was apparently careful in how he presented these numbers. The journal of the society member who read the paper notes, Thorne presents the scale calculation with evident discomfort. He writes that he has checked the arithmetic multiple times and cannot find an error. He does not claim the numbers are correct. He claims they follow from the measurements and that the measurements are correct. The fifth claim was historical. Thorne had spent time in the field speaking with indigenous communities in Venezuela and Ethiopia about the formations. He noted in the paper that the oral traditions of these communities described the formations consistently as remnants, as the remains of something that had once been alive. He was careful not to overstate this evidence. He described it as corroborating rather than primary. But he included it. 5 claims, all specific, all based on primary field data, none of them containing the kind of methodological weakness that would justify rejection without review. The paper was rejected in 11 days. What happened between the submission of the paper and its rejection? The Royal Geographical Society's records for this period are incomplete. Meeting minutes from late 1887 have gaps that archivists have noted but never explained. The correspondence file that would normally contain the rejection letter and any associated internal communication about Thorne's submission is missing, but other records survive, and they tell a partial story. On the 3rd day after Thorne's submission, a senior fellow of the Society named Arthur Pemberton, who held a joint appointment at the Society and at the newly formed British Geological Survey, wrote a letter to the Society's president. That letter survives in Pemberton's personal papers held at Cambridge. It reads in its relevant section, "I have reviewed the Thorne submission and find it presents a difficulty. The methodology is sound. The measurements are what they are. But the conclusion, if published, would require us to revisit classifications made over the past 60 years across hundreds of formations in territories currently under active governmental and commercial survey. The timing is particularly unfortunate, given the mineral extraction interests currently engaged in several of the formation sites Thorne discusses. I would recommend rejection on the grounds of insufficient peer review rather than on the merits, which are more substantial than we would wish. Reject it on procedural grounds, not on the merits, because the merits were substantial. On the 7th day after submission, Thorne was called to a meeting at the Society. No record of what was discussed at that meeting survives. Thorne wrote to his colleague afterward, the same colleague who had received the March 1884 letter, with a single sentence. They were not interested in whether the measurements were correct. On the 11th day, the rejection arrived, and the process that would remove Edmund Thorne from the scientific record began. The removal of a scientist from the record is not a dramatic event. It does not happen all at once. It happens gradually, through a series of small institutional decisions that individually seem unremarkable. Thorne's university position, a lectureship at University College London, was not renewed in 1889. The official reason given was budget restructuring. 3 other lectureships in the geology department were filled the same year. The papers Thorne had published before 1887, the 14 papers that had built his reputation, began to disappear from citation indexes. Not immediately, gradually. Papers that had cited his work on Lake District sedimentary formations stopped citing it in new editions. His name was removed from acknowledgement sections in revised printings of papers he had contributed to. By 1895, his pre-1887 publication record had been effectively orphaned. The work existed, but the professional network that gives work meaning had been quietly severed. The field notes, 3 years of primary research data from Wyoming, Venezuela, and Ethiopia, were deposited by Thorne in the University College London archive in 1886, before the paper was submitted. A formal receipt for their deposit exists. The notes themselves do not. An archive inventory from 1903 lists the deposit slot as empty, with a notation that reads, "Materials not located." Thorne himself continued to work. He spent the years after his university position was lost doing private consulting work for mining companies, work that kept him in contact with exactly the formations his research had focused on. There are letters from this period, written to the same colleague, that suggest he continued collecting data, continued refining his measurements. The letters become increasingly sparse after 1893. The last one, dated October 1895, contains a single relevant passage. "I have the measurements. I have always had the measurements. What I do not have is the institutional standing to make anyone take the measurements seriously. The measurements do not change. The institutions do not change either. I am no longer certain which of these facts is more important." Edmund Thorne died in 1901. He was 52. His obituary in a Bristol newspaper described him as a former geology lecturer. It mentioned his early publications. It did not mention the 1887 paper. It did not mention 3 years of fieldwork across 3 continents. It did not mention the measurement that he had told his colleague he could not stop thinking about in March of 1884. The obituary was 11 lines long. Edmund Thorne's story is not unique. The history of science contains dozens of documented cases of researchers whose findings conflicted with established institutional frameworks and who experienced professional consequences that cannot be fully explained by the quality of their work. What makes Thorne's case specifically relevant now is what has happened to the science since 1887. The measurements Thorne made, the diameter-to-wall thickness ratios, the silicon distribution analysis, the geometric comparisons between columnar formations and plant cell tissue, those measurements have been independently replicated, not in the context of the giant tree hypothesis, in the context of standard geological and biological research that had nothing to do with Thorne's conclusions. In 1962, a researcher studying biosilicification in gymnosperm tissue published ratio data that, when compared to the columnar jointing ratios published in a separate 1958 paper on Icelandic basalt formations, showed exactly the divergence Thorne had described in 1887. The 2 researchers never connected their findings. They were working in different fields. Neither one knew about Edmund Thorne. In 1989, a geological survey of the Tepuis in Venezuela published diameter variation data for the columnar structures on the formation walls. The coefficient of variation in that data falls outside the range for thermal stress fracture and inside the range for biological cellular organization. The survey did not note this. It classified the formations as geological and moved on. In 2003, a biogeochemist studying silicon cycling in ancient soils published analysis showing that certain rock formations classified as igneous showed silicon distribution patterns more consistent with biosilicification than with volcanic origin. The paper was published in a specialist journal. It was not widely read. It did not mention giant trees, 3 independent bodies of evidence, 3 different researchers working in 3 different decades in 3 different fields, all finding the same thing that Edmund Thorne found in 1887. None of them connected it to what Thorne had connected it to. Because Thorne's paper was never published, his name was removed from the record. The connection he had made, the specific, documented, measurement-based connection between the columnar formations and biological cellular geometry, had been erased before anyone could build on it. And the 3 researchers who independently found pieces of the same evidence had no way of knowing that someone had already assembled the complete picture 100 years before them. This is what erasure actually costs, not the suppression of one man's career, the suppression of a century of scientific progress. The questions that should have been asked in 1887 were not asked in 1890 or 1900 or 1950, because the foundation for asking them had been removed. The questions are being asked now. And the measurements, Thorne's measurements, the 1962 biosilicification data, the 1989 Tepuis survey, the 2003 silicon distribution analysis, they are all pointing in the same direction. Edmund Thorne spent 17 years taking measurements that he could not make anyone look at. He was not wrong about the measurements. The letter from the Society fellow who read his paper before the rejection makes that clear. The methodology was sound. The data was what it was. The conclusion followed from the data. What he was wrong about, what he underestimated, was the relationship between evidence and institution. The assumption that a measurement, if precise enough, if replicated enough, if presented in the right format to the right people, would eventually be taken seriously on its own terms. That assumption is not always correct. Institutions are not built to follow evidence. They are built to maintain frameworks. And when evidence threatens a framework, especially a framework with commercial and political implications, especially a framework that has been the foundation of professional identities for 50 years, the institution's response is not always to revise the framework. Sometimes it is to remove the evidence. Edmund Thorne's field notes are gone. His paper was never published. His name was systematically removed from the scientific record. The measurements he spent 3 years taking, across 3 continents, in conditions that required extraordinary physical and financial commitment, those measurements were erased. But the formations are still there. The Tepuis are still there. Devil's Tower is still there. The Amber formations are still there. The biological geometry is still in the rock. The cell-wall ratios are still measurable. The silicon distribution is still inconsistent with volcanic origin. The evidence Thorne found does not require Thorne to exist. It exists in the formations themselves, in the measurements that can still be taken today, with tools that are far more precise than anything available in 1887. The erasure was thorough, but it was not complete, because you cannot erase a stump. You can only convince people not to look at it. Subscribe, because the next video looks at the other researchers, the ones who came after Thorne, who found the same measurements and faced the same institutional response. The pattern is older than you think, and it is still operating.